Hello everyone and welcome to another Focus Mark 1 video, as ever predictable on this channel. In this episode I want to go and just show you a compilation of photos and quite a few insights really into the dark, stark reality of owning a Mark 1 Focus, and that is rust. Unfortunately, like many other Fords that have gone before it and some that came after, not necessarily as much, but it is typically a Ford. As much as the Focus for me is just a brilliant car in its own right, and the only Ford thing about it is the badge. Unfortunately, I'd be lying in saying that unfortunately Ford did manufacture the car, and therefore the rust protection was a little bit marginal. I would say the rust protection on a Mark 1 is significantly better than any other Ford that was produced at that age. And when I say significantly better, cast your eyes onto any Mark 1K. Oh, wait a second. Yeah, there's not many of them left, is there? Because they've all absolutely rotted in the usual areas of the sills, in the inner arches, at the front, at the rear, around the filler cap. You know the areas. They go so badly. It was almost like Ford actually didn't put any rust protection on that car, and I don't think they did because of the price point of that car. There was very little profit or no profit in that car whatsoever. The idea is that you would buy a KA and maybe be interested in buying another Ford. It was the era where Ford had to sort of create a car out of nothing really, in order to gain popularity in a new generation of younger drivers, and therefore drivers that might be interested in a Fiesta, Focus, Mondeo, etc., or another Ford in the future. And it certainly worked. But the Focus Mark 1 was significantly better than that. And the only reason why we are seeing significant amounts of rust is because they've just aged so, well, so much over 20 years. Mainly because of the mechanics. There are so many still around at 20 years old. How many cars of this age can you say that have got to 20 years of age with actual relative ease, to be honest? And because of their great age, therefore the rust is going to be more visible. My argument is that many cars of this period who didn't even reach 15 years old, if they were lucky, would not have shown anywhere near significant signs of rust in general. Because they haven't got to an age where they're going to show it as much. Now, 15 years is pretty good for most cars, but expected of a car of this generation. 20 years plus, which is what the Focus is now, not really. And it is just a credit to the design of the car that they've lasted such a long time. So the argument is, oh, Focus Mark 1s, they rot so badly. They were dreadful rot boxes. And I'm thinking, I know there were worse cars than others, especially 2003 cars in particular, and 2002 in some respects. But in general, I don't really buy that, to be honest, because they've aged and they've got to an age where rust is apparent. That does not mean that they are inherently a very rusty car. But, however, after being neglected, Bangonomics, and this is something I've continuously said over other episodes, Mark 1s have not been serviced, they've not been looked after, and therefore we're seeing a lot of examples, even some of the better examples, with some treatment needed. And that's usual, but usually it'd only be patches here and there. But I'm just going to show you some examples kindly sent in by a lovely group of people on the Ford Focus Preservation group, and I know those of you who are involved in the group will probably know the sort of video that I'm going to sort of display, because I did a shout out. Usually I concentrate, when I've spoken about rust, usually on the rear suspension arms especially, but we don't need to bother about that. I've spoken about that enough. I want to show people the reality, for those of you who don't have a Focus Mark 1 but might be looking at getting one, the reality of what you might be dealing with. It is wise not to go prodding too far, including in my own example where there are some areas of suspicion, but I'd rather not poke too much because you might find some nasty horrors. And I say mine's pretty solid, but they all hide problems. Let's take a look at a few pictures. So in the first picture, I'm going to show you this generic shot here. Now, that is typically what you are going to see on most Focus Mark 1s that have not been well maintained. Mainly because they've done too many winters. As I say, they've done 20 years of salt winters. Some of them less so, but that is the consequence. And they always tend to go on the rear seals more than the front seals, mainly because all it takes is some dirt and contamination and water to get into that rear of the sill, and there are a few ways that it gets in via the rear wheel arch, where the inner arch meets the bottom of the sill. They are welded together. They're two pieces, and when there is some sort of perforation, water gets in and usually stays in the rear of the sill and will continue just eating away very, very quickly. And over a period of a few years, you will have some perforations, and it is not too uncommon to see this. This is a more extreme example at this stage, because I'm not seeing many cars get to this stage, or at least most that have looked like that down the years are no longer with us for obvious reasons, for this particular reason, in fact. But here we've actually lost the entire piece at the rear end of the sill, which usual. The undersill is peeling. That is usually the first sign of trouble that you can see in the sort of furthermost left hand of this picture, and also some bubbling on the face of the outer sill, where you can physically see just by looking at it. And if you can see some bubbling on the outside of the sill, I'm afraid there are problems on the inside that might be too far gone. Although I would say if it's just minor bubbling and there are no perforations by some minor miracle, I would definitely put some sort of Dynax into the inner sill via the interior, because at least the Dynax can suffocate what's there and possibly prevent more things happening. But still, when you get to that stage, it's often best to just have it cut out, and you will see plenty of Mark 1s with the patches in those areas that have been done just to get it through another MOT. But on the other side of things, you'll most likely have a Mark 1 that will go through this stage at some point, minded, and it's this. So it's starting to go a bit more than desirable. I mean, most Mark 1s that I see have still got some minor bubbling on the arches. Unfortunately, there is some evidence that has been noticed by a few people that the arch lips on my car, despite having been sprayed and painted and rust killed and protected, are starting to show minor microscopic signs of the bubbling coming back. Yes, it is unfortunately something that you can't really kill off altogether. It's a case of every so often you've got to have the arch lips sanded down, rust converted and sprayed up again before you get any form of holes or corrosion. Luckily, my arch lips were actually looking really good underneath when the body man took it back to bare metal. I was surprised that he didn't say there was some minor holes, but in this case there wasn't. I was really pleased about that, because that could have been an extremely big bill, but it wasn't. It was a really it was a real relief, I can tell you. But that is the stage in which it gets a little bit more frilly, and you are going to have to consider jumping in, because you don't want the arch lips. The arch lips are quite expensive as a job to replace, because effectively your body man has got to cut the out panel, which you can see that's rusty in this picture, and then re-weld a piece of metal and then seam it against the inside. If you're unlucky enough to have both the inner arch and the outer arch lip, both pieces rot out, and you're left with nothing, that's even more expensive. So you really want to keep on top of that before it becomes a big problem, because that's going to be a few hundred aside at least, just to have a plate melded, or just to have the right metal welded in before you've even put any paint down on the surface. And then typically on a Focus Mark 1, at the front end of the car, which is probably the most isolated area, we know that the bottoms of the front wings tend to go. I'll show you a picture of that in a bit. It's this. This is a picture of Stuart Taylor's Focus Millennium, which was featured on Hubnut's channel. That was the state that the front wing was in when he got it. So clearly somebody had been with the old gaffer tape to stop water getting in. Yes, black gaffer tape on a white and a yellow car. Great visual element there. But they do tend to rot in that area, and I can't explain why. It's not a particular mud trap, although there are some bits of dirt that get lodged in the corner. That can be the only reason that they go in that area. I'm hoping that the aftermarket Mark 1 front wings that are manufactured today probably may not have that issue. It's just a generic issue. I think that is a problem with the original Ford ones. However, I would say, and this is a picture of an RS Mark 1, but nevertheless, bottom of the front wings, yes, that's also a bit of an issue as well. You don't want that getting too frilly, otherwise you could see through the other side, and that's quite usual to see that, unfortunately. But as I say, aftermarket front wings and a bolt on and off situation, it's as simple as that, but obviously get it resprayed. That's the only solution to dealing with those two particular issues in this case, but something to be aware of. When they start bubbling, please don't think about trying to repair it, or I just think it's not worth your time. Just factor in you've got to replace that wing and factor in paintwork to make it match relatively to the rest of the car. If you factor that in, it's probably going to be about 250 quid for it to be properly redone, you know, sanded and painted up, maybe less than that. And if you want to fit it yourself, that's even less. If you want to have it fitted, probably 250 to 300. Factor in that cost and you won't be wasting your time. But for me, like I've repeated as well, the cause of the rear sills rotting out starts with this section of metalwork. Now, this is a photo taken off an RS Mark 1, but like every other Mark 1, this is the main area, and I think most of you know exactly what this area is. It is the area that you cannot see if you have those dreaded arch liners, and I suggest you do remove them, because what you see in that photo is some deterioration of the metalwork behind that arch liner as you're looking towards the rear of the sill. That is in fact the rear end of the sill where it meets the inner arch, and it is starting to go. And when it's starting to go like that, there probably will be some hole. And naturally, as the owner, and I'm just going to show you another picture, that is another picture of it starting to deteriorate again. It doesn't look too bad, but it looks like something that can be treated. Oh yeah? Okay. Well, if we have a look at this picture on the other side, it's completely rotten. Absolutely shot. And I tell you what, that's where my Mark 1 started to go before it had the metalwork done. My bodyman had to weld, strangely it was on the passenger side also, my bodyman had to weld a new plate into that part of the sill. Now you imagine guys, that is where it starts. There is a pinhole, there is a weakness, water is getting sloshed past that arch liner, it doesn't stop it, and it's sitting there in that little gully just eating away at that metal, and it's causing that hole, and eventually it will rust through, and then water has a way of getting into the sill. Not just water, dirt, muck, clay, because we know how mucky the arches can get if you're not washing it down. All sorts of stuff get in there, and that is how it gets into the rear of the sill and starts this whole process. And what you end up with is a car that looks like this, and that is an extreme case, but it's not extreme, is it? Because when you have a completely rotten rear sill, and it doesn't just rot the sill, it actually rots the whole corner, the inner sill, the outer sill, and then it starts rotting on the inner arch as well, and then it goes on the back side, very close to where your train arm bush sits. That is really bad. That is part of the inner sill, and that is supposed to be rock solid, and it eats all the way up. And it starts from a pinhole that started many years ago that the owner had absolutely no idea about, and suddenly it fails the MOT because the entire rear end of the sill has completely gone a few years later. And if you see that sign, it's like the first picture of this video, it really is daunting, and I question the sanity of anyone who wants to do that, apart from the fact that it is for the love of keeping a car on the roads. My argument is there are many Mark 1s that are in better condition, and if you've just bought a Mark 1 and discovered that, get a quote, but be prepared to walk away from that car and get another one, because at the moment, I'm being realistic, I would not be wanting to spend probably £1,000's worth of work. I would say that side would cost £1,000's worth of work, not just all the metal that needs in, that's paint as well to make it look as if it was factory. That'd be £1,000 per side, probably more. I think there's a few bodywork people would be looking at that and thinking, you're joking, £1,000, cheap job, yeah, 1,500. Well, each their own on that one, but for 1,500, you could buy a much better Mark 1 today. And that's today. And that's the problem we're facing here. And that's why still I think a lot of Mark 1s will just go to the scrap. Now, my advice is being very, very, very careful about your finances. It is just a car at the end of the day. And as much as I, you know, share passion in keeping as many of these on the roads, you know, there is an element of, you know, there is a cost of living crisis. People have got other priorities, family, kids. We want to go, I don't want to get into detail in this video, but at the end of the day, if I saw that and I've got kids waiting hand on foot on me, I cannot justify to my kids and my missus that £1,500 worth of work has gone into one corner of the car. I've got the other side to do yet. I just can't justify it. And I just think when a Mark 1 gets to this stage, unless you're capable of doing your own welding, forget it. That's too far gone. But in this case, it was repaired. So I'm just going to show you a few pictures of some repairs being done to the actual car. I mean, that was after. That was actually the work being done after with all new metal. It looks fantastic, doesn't it? That's exactly what you want to see. All new metal all the way across. And it starts from there and you work your way backwards. You've just got to try and find all that rust. If the inner sill has started to go, again, that starts causing more headaches in terms of the cost, so be very wary. Once you've done that job, stuff it full of Dynax, cavity wax, Dinitrol, whatever, some sort of cavity wax. You want it oozing out of the drain holes and you just leave it. It's simple. Make sure that if you are getting your body shop to make a new sill, or if you're doing it yourself or someone's doing it, make sure they are creating some new drain holes. We want that sill to be able to drain itself. You want to see some of that cavity wax oozing out the drain holes, just so that if any water got into the sill, it goes straight back out. But either way, you've got cavity wax there to protect it. But make sure that water has got an ability to go in and straight out. A lot of Mark 1s have blocked water holes. If you look along your sill, if it's an original sill, look at the main water holes. Check that they're not blocked. Put some sort of pin through them. They're very, very thin. Something very, very small, and just jab it and make sure. You might find a bit of rust coming out of it, mind you. There'll be some bits coming out, but just jab at it. Make sure it goes all the way through, whether it's a tiny little ruler, which might be able to poke through, but some sort of tool to get up there and then clear the holes. So please check that. But this is superb work, and we can see the element of this compared with what it did look like, which was this. This particular car looked like that before, where it was just sort of eating away and the undersill was peeling away. The first sign of trouble is when that thick original factory undersill, which most Mark 1s, my car doesn't have that now, it's all stone chipped. But that thick bead of undersill that goes all the way along the length, it's almost like seam sealer almost, really, that sort of type. It should be, you should not be able to pull it off. If you are having bits of it fall off, you've got rust underneath, and big style. That's the first clue. Not good. Well, what also happens with this car's inevitable ability to rust is also the inner arches, because if your outer sills are rotten, your inner arches will be rotten as well. And in the inner arch, it's this. It's typically a picture like this. That is how my rear arch looked like before it got welded. It's not my particular car, this picture, but mine is a very, very similar size and dimension. Luckily, the rust had not spread to the seat belt anchor points, which are very, very close. Sometimes you have to completely cut out that metal and have your body man drill new holes and tap in some new threads for the seat belts to go into, because that part is also rotten. It's also a failure of the MOT because the seat belts could pull out of the metal. And I've not known an instance of that, but I'm sure there's a first time, and there'll be one Mark 1 somewhere which has that particular issue when the tester tugs on the belt and finds it comes off from the bottom. But it can spread very much, and it spreads to this point. It goes all along the seam of the boot. The actual connection between the boot floor and the inner arches is completely broken because the rust has crept along the seam sealer. That is very common. Mine started to do that, and I've just about caught it in time, but it might need some attention and some new pieces at some point in the future. But being garaged, I don't think it'll be a problem. But it will creep in, and it will creep all the way to the back of the car if you're not lucky. But also, you'll probably see some evidence on the other side, including this. You will see some minor rust along where the seam is on the other side. If you see it on that side, then I would check the boot side, because most likely it'll be rotten from the inside to out, strangely enough, not the outside to in. It doesn't always work from the outside to in. So yeah, that's something to be very aware of. We will have to cut the whole seam seal and just have the whole thing redone in metal, and obviously it'd be at like a 90-degree bend, so a little bit of the boot floor and a bit of the inner arch, and it will be welded all the way across. Difficult job, very, very difficult job, because some of the seams kind of overlap. So again, just bear that in mind, and you know, Mark 1 buying advice, please check your boot floors, because that's the first sign, and you can check for inner arch rot as they usually go. But otherwise, you know, you start getting to situations where, you know, you've got this. I mean, that's bad. That's really bad. I mean, that is not just rotted way more than the other example, but it's actually grown and it's actually extended to the seatbelt anchorage points. That's where it becomes even more tricky to weld, because you're talking about like having to drop the suspension, because the train arm bush is mounted extremely close to that point, just further up, but it won't take long before the rust will just creep to that position. There's some more pictures here that I've got to show you. I mean, you take a look at this. I mean, that's just ridiculous. That's just, no, there's nothing left of, again, the outer sill. That's just another example of how they go really, really badly to the point where there's nothing really left at all. Again, this one is another example, just got no outer sill again. And that one's gone in both. Unfortunately, this example is really bad. The inner arch is gone. You can see the actual arch lip has gone on both pieces of metal, like I said earlier, and the outer. It's just, oh, it's a mess. It's a real mess. It's putting that right. I will show you this picture actually, which is very minute. All this is quite random, but I'm going with this. That is a bit of the seam sealer coming off on the inside of the boot, and it's one of those things where you spot it and you can't help poking, and when you poke at things it just comes apart, and then you find a hole and your whole day's wrecked. It's like, why did I just do that? Why didn't I just leave it and forget about it? It's good that you haven't left it, because you leave things like that, it's spread along the whole seam. So just find out how big it is and deal with it. And if you have to put a temporary blob, ground it back to metal, find out what's there, put some fiberglass in, temporary fiberglass, fill it over, and then say, right, I'll come back to that and get it properly welded at a later date, because that's my advice. Saying that I've put a bit of fiberglass on my own, a couple of my cars in the past, but it's only temporary fixes. They're always a way of making sure that there's, to assess how big the hole is, to make sure that the fiberglass goes rock hard. It makes sure that water cannot enter the car or go where it shouldn't go, as a means in a temporary fashion before you get metal done at a later date. It's always the best way. It's always the best way, especially if you can't weld, like most of us anyway. Another area of concern. So this picture shows from the inside of the car looking out. That is the inner arch that has just been welded up really neatly. And again, if the outer arch has gone and the end of the sill has gone, the inner arch, that bit can get rather scabby. Mine's starting to get a bit brown, sort of orange spotty recently again, but it's pretty solid. But the point is to keep an eye on that because it is so close to where everything is in terms of the suspension. Train arm bushes are just mounted further along, but be very, very wary of that area. And just, if you can get your head under the car and look inwards, you know, it's not just point looking at the sill. Get under the car and look outwards at that position on both sides. Now, usually there'd be some sort of plastic shield that covers that area over. I threw them on in the bin years ago. They're rubbish. They literally clip to the bottom of that area just to cover the handbrake cable. You don't need it, just throw it in the bin, honestly. It actually causes a bit of a trap where mud can actually sit on the plastic piece of trim and actually sit against the inner arch in that particular piece of metal. So again, be very careful. But above all areas that I've gone over in this episode, there's one serious area that I've not seen many Mark 1s get so bad they've actually rotten through at this age. Not to say that this is not going to be a problem now and going forwards. People look at the sills, they look at the usual areas of the inner arches, especially obviously at the rear arches we're talking about, but then you look up. Oh, yeah, that is not good. That is the strut tower area where your shock absorber goes in. It is mostly covered up by the carpet arch liner. Please take it off. You need to see what's under this area. I mean, on this picture, the two straight pieces of metal that allow the arch liner to kind of sit in the arch, that's obviously broken on the right hand side. It's completely gone. It's only a thin piece of metal. I actually want to cut mine off because I don't have arch liners no more. I want to cut mine completely off because they're starting to look a bit frilly again, and I do think that mine could go that way maybe in a few years time, even with a dry garage and only driving it in the dry. That is the truth, but that actually doesn't look too bad. It is starting to go at the top, but just take the shock absorber off to assess the metal around the top of the shock absorber. It doesn't look too bad, but it needs to be treated. That's a treatable situation because that piece of metal is about 4 millimeters thick, maybe 5 millimeters. That is thick steel at the top of that strut tower, and to go through that, you have to be, well, it must have been really neglected and never washed, because I'm just going to show you this picture of absolute disgust. Just, you're going to feel a bit sick when I show you this. Just hang fire. Yeah. That's disgusting. It's absolutely rotten. There's nothing left. I mean, literally, it has got holes everywhere at the top. It's just horrible. I don't even... Actually, I'm just going to turn this picture off. I don't even want to look at it. It's that bad. That's gone all the way through. And that is going to be probably a more expensive job than any of the other jobs put together. Because to do that job properly, I mean, my first suggestion is if you've got a little bit of loss of metal, mine's lost a bit of metal, would be to actually get a body man to do this, a welder who knows what they're doing, and to actually clean all the metal at the top and weld a strengthening plate over the top. It doesn't matter if your shock absorber sits fractionally lower, because they've made the metal a little bit too thick and it sits fractionally lower. There's enough thread at the top to thread it in on the other side. So don't worry about that, because the shock absorber will just compensate for that. As long as it's not too far lower, you know, probably a 3-4 millimeter plate welded to the existing metal, you have to clean that metal back to bare metal to do that, because you don't want to put new metal over rusty and then it just rusts internally between the two pieces. That's my suggestion. I may take my own suggestion up one day, but hopefully mine are not too bad. I've got there in time, and it's really not bad. There's no, on the other side of the car, if you go on the boot side, have a look for any sign of brown corrosion around that top end. And if there's no sign, you're good. It hasn't gone through. There is no sign of any perforation, but it doesn't mean that you can rest on the libels. You have to keep on top of that. Personally, if it has rotted through like that other picture and you want to save the car, go to a scrapyard Focus and cut the strut tower off. Cut as much as what you want off it and give it to your body man and weld a new strut tower from the inside of the car out. That is the only solution. That's a lot of work, but it is the only solution. Recently, someone who I know owns an Alfa Romeo. You know, they enjoy rusting more than Fords. He has had to get welding done on his 156. The front strut shock absorber towers had rotted from the inside of the engine bay. It literally started to break off. There was no structural rigidity on that McPherson strut at the front. So he needed to get a completely new cut McPherson strut off another Alfa, which was in much better condition. It's difficult to get even spare parts. Even a donor car would be difficult to get that sort of metal, because apparently it happens all the time on them. Luckily on Mark 1s, they don't ever rot on the McPherson strut towers ever. I pretty much doubt that, unless it's severely neglected. Maybe this example or the last one I was saying. But this is really a depressing episode and a very long one. I'm going to stop talking here. But you really do need to weigh the odds up with a Mark 1 Focus and make sure that you are doing the right thing for you. I think it's the first thing you can ever do when you go to view one, is to have a look in all these areas and make a very, very quick judgment on, yep, okay, so this is what I'm dealing with. And it's probably the single most discouraging factor on why someone who runs the Mark 1 preservation group, starting out with my own Focus, as a bit of a trailblazer of a car, I think. Well, inspiration, put it that way. It's not what it might be one of the best now, but it might not be, judging on the amazing work that's going on. But why that person would not want another Focus Mark 1, instead bought a Rover 45 as a daily driver. And the truth of the matter is, Rover 45s don't rust as badly as Focus Mark 1s. And as a car that I need to work, I was not intending on buying another Mark 1 and running it into the ground. I just wasn't going to do that. So the best solution was to actually go with another brand that I'm a very massive enthusiast of, and that's Rover. And that is why I don't have two Ford Focus Mark 1s. And that is generically why it is a big off-putting factor as to why I don't own a second one. Owning one is expensive enough. And for those of you who've got more than one, you'll probably realise that very soon, sadly, unless you've got deep pockets. And on that rather balanced but depressing note, I will leave this episode here. I hope this has been useful and has shown that, yeah, Mark 1s are showing their age a lot in the bodywork. Take care, guys.